Hello again, everyone. I'm Dr. George Simon, and welcome to another edition of the new Character Matters program. This is the program where we talk about what I consider to be the defining issue of our time, the character crisis that we've been in for some time now, and that affects every single aspect of our lives. Not a day goes by that we either don't read about, hear about, or personally witness something egregious happening. A person does the unthinkable, and then the finger pointing starts, pointing to all kinds of things. And if we just had a law about this or a restriction about that, we'd be safe, we'd be secure. When in fact, it all hinges on character. It always has, it always will. And it's not like we human beings haven't always had our character-related problems. We have. But problems have mounted over the past several decades because of a classic vicious cycle going on between certain norms in the culture affecting the character development of people and the increasing numbers of character deficient people populating our societies, further eroding whatever institutions and structures were left to help foster character development. Character has mattered forever. It will always matter. It is our best defense. It is our only defense against the ills that we suffer in our relationships, in our community relations, in our intimate friendships and intimate partnerships. It affects everything. And we human beings are not naturally civilized and people of integrity of character. That has to be formed in us. And we have to have certain capacities for that formation to be solid. But we also have to have what capacities we do have nurtured and especially reinforced. Character will reign supreme again when we recover its importance and when we come to expect it, even demand it, and especially when we reinforce it instead of reinforcing all the character deficiencies we see all around us. It does not pay to be a decent human being. In fact, it's come to pay a lot not to be a decent human being. And that's why we are in the state we're in. Now, I've been doing a series before the last live podcast on commonly misunderstood and misused terms. And I've made the point, very sad point, that many times even the most well-trained professionals are some of the most egregious misusers of terms. And today I want to talk about something special because I learned something very early on in my research into character disturbances many years ago, over 40 years ago now. And what I learned was that our classical perspectives, our classical psychological paradigms that focused extraordinarily heavily on folks' fears and insecurities as the roots, basically, of all their psychological problems, were missing a big part of what it is to be a human being. Yes, we do have fears, and yes, we do have insecurities, and yes, those fears and insecurities and those traumas we experience as we're growing up do affect our personality and our character development. And yes, they do cause us some internal emotional conflicts. And yes, those things are perfect fodder for traditional insight-oriented psychotherapeutic approaches. However, our fears and our insecurities are not the whole story. They're not the whole story. A big part of what can go wrong with us and with our relationships has to do not so much with what we run from, or what we're afraid of, but what we desire and what we fight for. Let me say that again. So many of our problems are not rooted as much in what we're afraid of and therefore run from, which is the sole focus of most traditional psychological approaches. So many of our problems are much more related to the things that we desire and that we're willing to fight for. And I'm choosing that word fight very carefully, because we human beings are not just runners, we're fighters, and we do an awful lot of fighting, and not just when we're afraid or because we have to defend ourselves. It is in our nature not just to run, but also to fight, and not just when we're afraid of something or when we're terrified or we feel under attack and feel the need to defend ourselves. We are human beings that crave things, who want things, and many times are willing to fight for them. And why and how we fight largely defines a good part of our character. I see people racing through the streets, desiring to get from point A to point B in as quick a time as they can because they have other things on their mind. They're not always thinking, oh my goodness, I must get to the hospital because somebody's about to perish and I might miss my last moments with them. That's not always the motivation. The motivation is not always fear. Sometimes people just want things, and they're willing to pay little attention to traffic signals and to stop signs and to yield signs in their desire to get there, to achieve their goals, without much thought about how it might impact the person in the next lane. The same thing happens in relationships. People want things, expect things of their partners, and they're willing to go to war for them sometimes. Sometimes the causes are noble. Sometimes they're purely selfish. But we have become a society of unscrupulous fighters. This is what I learned very early on. And some people fight covertly. They are the most manipulative characters. This was the source of inspiration for my first and still most popular book, acclaimed around the world as the go-to book for explaining manipulative characters and how they operate, because it once and for all dispelled the notion that the certain behaviors that are so common to manipulators aren't defensive maneuvers at all, but offensive tactics, fighting weapons to get what they want with pure awareness and intention. And I called this phenomenon behind most manipulative behavior covert aggression, because that's just what it is. And what it is not, and that's why I'm speaking to the issue today about the commonly misused terms, and unfortunately just as misused many times by people trained to know better, but sometimes poorly trained and sometimes still misguided in their perceptions, which always has an implication for effective intervention, by the way. You can't misperceive something and then intervene adequately enough. That's just not possible. But covert aggression is not, as is sometimes misnamed, passive aggression. And covertly aggressive characters are not passive aggressive personalities. There's a difference, huge difference. And believe me, it would take an entire workshop to explain all of the differences. But I am going to explain some things about human aggression that I think are important to get straight. Words have to mean things, and especially in science, in any kind of science. The accurate use of terms helps us really understand the core of the issues. We human beings fight. We fight a lot. We fight primarily not just to protect ourselves and not out of fear or threat, but we mostly fight to get the things that we want. Now, how we fight and what we fight for has a lot to do with who we are in character. When we fight for the legitimate things that we need to survive and prosper, and we fight with proper concern for the impact of our expression of energy to get that something that we want that's of appropriate need and value, when we're basically fighting, directing our energy toward the pursuit of goals for things that are valid and that all human beings really need, and we're doing that with proper respect for others and with regard not to needlessly injure, and with respect for the legitimate concerns of others who might be involved in our pursuits, we call that assertiveness. We call that assertion, and that's a wonderful thing. But when we fight underhandedly, when we fight subtly, when we fight deceptively, deviously, with trickery, when we try to get others to cave into our demands, whether they're legitimate or not, when we want to appear like we're doing anything else but trying to have the upper hand, trying to get our way, or trying to get the other person to cave into our demands, when we're doing that, we're fighting covertly, not passively. There's nothing passive about that kind of behavior, nothing passive whatsoever. It's a mislabel. Aggression can be overt, out in the open, where I don't care who knows what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. I make no bones about it. That's overt. It can be undercover. That's covert. It can be direct. It can also be indirect. In other words, I can fight indirectly, say through another person, or even use a system to my advantage. Like I said, this topic is one I can do a whole day's workshop on, but words have to mean things. And there are hundreds of books out there misusing terms. I'm not exaggerating. So I'm trying to make some clarifications here with a real purpose in mind. Because once we know what we're talking about, once we know what's really going on in our relationships, it's empowering. It's empowering when we see things accurately, and our labels help us do that. And our words have to have meanings. Covert aggression is active, not passive. In other words, the person is deliberately doing something as opposed to not doing something, which is the definition of the passive part of passive aggression. I'll speak to that again in just a minute. So covert aggression is active aggression, often, not always, but often direct aggression, but undercover, under the guise of something else. Now, there's a good reason for the kinds of personalities that I call the aggressive personalities. Personalities that are more than merely narcissistic. because their primary agenda is always to dominate within a relationship. So it's more than just narcissism, which is bad enough, of course. But there's a reason for aggressing so covertly, for using certain tactics to get your way. And the reason is very simple. If I'm open, if I'm overt about my aggression, if I make no bones about it, if I tell you I'm out to dominate you, to control you, to make you always capitulate to my demands, if I make that very clear and obvious, I might just encounter resistance. So it's a more effective way to fight sometimes, to conceal my true intentions and my true character, and to mischaracterize what I'm doing as anything but fighting with you, to have the upper hand and to have my way. Now, you might suspect otherwise. Your gut might tell you, he or she is just fighting with me to have their way. But if the person is very good at the art of impression management, knows how to play the victim role seriously, knows how to polish those excuses, knows how to frame things in a way that casts you as the real aggressor, all the other tactics that I described in my books, then you begin to doubt. At some point, you can even begin to doubt your sanity. All the tactics and how they're used, especially by the most skilled manipulative personalities, induce what is commonly called the gaslighting effect. So there's a purpose, a method, and an effective one at that, to aggressing covertly as opposed to overtly. Just as there is method to aggressing passively or indirectly. And we'll talk about those other modes of aggression on another program. So when I play the victim, when I pretend that I'm the wounded party, to play on your sympathy and then get you to back down and see things my way, when I know full well I have overstepped, but I still want you to capitulate because I still want my way, because that's just how selfish I am. When I do those kinds of things, I am covertly aggressing, and I know it. Conscious, direct, anything but passive, very active, but covert, undercover, under the guise of something else. I'm acting like the wounded party because I know that you, in your sensitivity, will back down if you think that I'm really wounded or that I might be wounded, that you have that much conscientiousness. And that's how I succeed in manipulating you. That's how I succeed in getting you to cave in. This was the insight, and I have to tell you that most of the insight came with getting the words and the terms straight. Words have to mean things. So many words in common parlance coming out of psychological speak these days are so egregiously misused, it makes my head spin. You can tell I've got a soapbox here. Acting out, for example, has become synonymous with misbehavior. It's not. Some misbehavior can be an example of acting out. But the term is used widely these days to describe misbehavior when it's not. Passive aggression is another one. I can think of even book titles that use that term in the title and then go on inside the book to describe covert aggression. Passive aggression and covert aggression are two very different things because covert aggression is active. not passive aggression. The person is doing something as opposed to not doing something, and on purpose as opposed to unconsciously, and to attack and get your capitulation as opposed to defending themselves primarily. Denial. We'll spend some time with denial because that term has a specific psychological meaning that has been so corrupted and so distorted over the years that we barely really know what it is anymore. One thing it's not for sure is it's not the same thing as lying. And all too many helping professionals waste an awful lot of time and energy these days attempting to nursemaid people who are never in a state of denial in the first place out of such a state. We'll talk about that at some later point, too, in one of the podcasts. I'm passionate about these things, as you know, which is why I've written so many books. And I'm most passionate about Essentials for the Journey, my latest book, and I really hope and pray that long before the campaign starts to promote it, which will be very soon now, that folks will find it on Amazon, review it, and recommend it to their friends, because we have a lot of work to do to restore character to its rightful place in our society, to come to expect it of ourselves and each other again, and to reinforce it, to reinforce any effort towards it. It's what we need to get us out of the mess that we've been in. Not a day goes by without another horrific headline. We're out of control, and we know it. And hopefully, we're in the beginning stages of realizing how crucial it is, not only that we turn things around, but how we must turn things around. By reclaiming the importance of character once again, by rediscovering all that it takes to forge it, and by truly changing the face of the world, one heart at a time, starting with, of course, our own. Till next time, I'm Dr. George Simon. I invite you to mosey on over to the blog at drgeorgesimon.com. Take advantage of this week's and all the many articles free of charge that you might find helpful in navigating through your relationships and through your difficulties in life. And I hope you tune in next time for another edition of the New Character Matters program. Until then, I'm Dr. George Simon. Take care.